Political Science 335, International Politics. This is our last class for this semester. It's been a pleasure, and I'll hope to see you again. So the challenge for us is to place, for you as students, is to place the this idea, this focus on the Middle East in the context of international politics, and to give time for my guests to be here. Let's watch this first clip on Afghanistan. It's a clip that relates to what I am going to ask my guest when he's here. So we'll see you in a few seconds.
Afghanistan has erupted in anger and violence following the burning of a Koran by Pastor Terry Jones and his church, the Dove Outreach Center in Gainesville, Florida, less than 2 weeks ago. The incident drew little attention in the United States, but it has provoked outrage in the Muslim world with deadly consequences in Afghanistan. In Kandahar, the violence left 9 people dead and more than 80 others injured. The rioting happened one day after an angry mob stormed a UN compound in northern Afghanistan. That attack left 11 people dead, including 7 UN employees. President Obama has called the burning of the Koran an act of extreme intolerance and bigotry. But he said that doesn't justify the killing of innocent people, which he said was outrageous and an affront to human decency and dignity. Meanwhile, the UN's top envoy in Afghanistan said the organization would not be driven away by Friday's deadly attack, but would relocate temporarily to Kabul.
Having assessed the situation and having discovered by going into the office that the office is destroyed, I have decided to redeploy, I repeat, redeploy, not evacuate, temporarily to Kabul.
A formal inquiry is underway, but the envoy said that initial reports indicate that a number of insurgents infiltrated the demonstrators who overran the compound. He said if the Afghan police had provided better security, the compound would not have been attacked. But he placed direct blame on those who burned the Koran in Florida last month. Afghanistan's President Hamid Karzai expressed regret for the 20 deaths since Friday, but he also further stoked possible anti-foreign sentiment by demanding that the United States and the United Nations bring to justice the man behind the Koran burning, Pastor Terry Jones. Jones had threatened to burn a copy of the Koran last year, but then backed down. Friday, he said that Islam and its followers, not his church's burning of the Koran, were responsible for the killings. Sophia Manos, The Associated Press.
We'll come back to Dominguez Hills. We are live on online, and we are fortunate to have again with us Dr. Zaman Stanizai. Professor Stanizai, welcome to the program. I have to ask you the question, not because you are originally from Afghanistan, but you have a perspective on what's happening. And let me rephrase the question this way. A year ago in Florida, the priest wanted to burn the Quran, and suddenly, he refrained from doing it. 2 weeks ago, he did. He burned it, and then the story really didn't make the headlines. Some argue that Karzai's speech just a few days ago ignited the issue, and had he just ignored it, nothing would happen. He used it. He used the speech for his own political opportunistic agenda. Is this what happened, or the issue is much bigger than that?
I think if our media is really globally oriented, this would not have happened. The reason nobody heard anything about it here, it's not because it didn't happen, but because the media in that part of the world showed it over and over again. And so what happened was that the leaders of both Afghanistan and Pakistan felt pressured that they had to say something about it. Especially since they are both U.S. allies and whatever other kind of title you may put on them, that their close alliance with the United States, pressured them in a way to say something. And both the President of Pakistan and the President of Afghanistan made comments on it. So that may be, I think that's stretching it. it is not that, I mean, if they hadn't said anything, the people would have demanded that they react to it.
But the argument runs like this. It wasn't that, until Karzai made his statement. Really, there were not major demonstrations. There were a few hundreds here and there. It wasn't a major event, but once Karzai spoke about it, suddenly the things start to take major emphasis, and there were bigger demonstrations. And now, you know, things are getting a little bit more interesting. Yeah.
I think that we are detaching causality here.
Okay.
Karzai didn't do anything other than, as a head of a government, to address an issue. And I don't know how much pressure was upon him or upon Zardari, the president of Pakistan, because both of them addressed the issue. And in a way they had to. Just the way President Obama addressed it, that it was a wrong thing to do to kill innocent people. And even if all of the people who were killed you know, within the confines of the United Nations building, even if they were not Americans, leaders in every country are expected to address these issues. Whether he inflamed it or not, that I can't say. But my point is that if we blame this on Karzai, then we might also blame similar situations on the president of Pakistan, because he also addressed, and I'm sure other leaders of other countries in the region did it too. Because with modern technology, Twitters and Facebook and all that, and the internet, the word gets around, and it gets around very effectively these days. That's why we have all the revolutions going on there, and nobody can stop that.
But I have to ask you this question before I move on to the bigger picture. This question is that why a year ago this issue was on the big news? Everybody was talking about it. It was on every major news outlet. This time around, nobody's talking about it, didn't talk about it when the actual burning happened. They talked about it when we've seen what's happening in Afghanistan, but not before that. Why is the difference?
I think if the media had taken the attitude it took now, if this had been the attitude of the media a year ago in September, nothing would have happened. But the point is that they got enough mileage out of it then, but perhaps there were other quote-unquote harder issues for the media to be preoccupied with, like Libya and Yemen and so on, that they didn't pay attention to it here. Whereas for the consumption of the people in the region, that was a hot issue, especially since this burning, for some reason, whether it was planned, intended, or coincidental, it was done on the Afghan New Year, March 20th. And the Afghan New Year is celebrated, the center of the celebration is in Mazar-e-Sharif in the northern Afghanistan, in this very mosque. So whether it was a confluence of events that somehow brought everything to Mazar-e-Sharif, that the celebration of the New Year maybe a few days before that, and the burning of the Quran on that date, and the broadcasting of it around the country, or rather the region, I think it was probably inevitable that there had to be a reaction. But I neither intend to defend Karzai's speech. Whatever he has said, I haven't heard it, nor do I think that the people did the right thing. But it's mob mentality. And in mob mentalities, these kind of things do happen, unfortunately, and it's very, very sad that it happens to people who work with the United Nations, to people who are helping the people of Afghanistan. But I'm sure that it was just the mob mentality that took over.
Let me ask you about the big picture. Now, the conflict, sort of this idea that project Islam as the enemy, that the emphasis on extremism, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, all these groups. Somehow, with the Egyptian revolution, the Tunisian revolution, and the change of waves in the Middle East, somehow that was interpreted as the Islamist extremism have lost ground. In other words, we really came to see that the Middle East is better represented, that there are some democratic forces, that there are some people who want a certain kind of secular government, or they basically really view religion like any other. It's not this extremism that they made it. Now, this week, the extremism is back on the front. Do you see any connection there, or is it done pure coincidental?
No, I think I see the connection, but I see connections. The way it's portrayed is that the one connection that is often referred to is the connection between extremism and Islam, that Islam is extremist, and they use the two words sort of interchangeably and synonymously. Yeah. But the point is that in every movement, religious or otherwise, there are extremes. Right now, we have extremists of many other faiths, some who might be even considered legitimate governments because they were voted in. To me, Hamas is as extremist and as legitimate because it was voted in as the Likud government is. They're both religious, they're both extremist, and yet we associate excuse me, extremism only with one of them, not with the other.
Why is that?
That's because the media here in the West see it through a lens of cultural relativism. Yeah. So that if it's our extremism, we attribute it or the responsibility is sort of centered on one individual person, a deranged person or a sick person, a psychopath or this or that. We find other reasons other than the religion to blame an extremist action of, say, quote unquote, a religious, a Christian extremist, or for that matter, a Jewish extremist. But when it happens to for a Muslim to act in an extremist way, every other reason is pushed aside. The only identity that counts is that this was a Muslim extremist, and therefore, in the case of a Muslim extremist, we emphasize the religion. In the case of a non-Muslim extremist, we emphasize everything else but religion. And so that's where the double standard is.
Well, Romana has a question for you. Would following Islamic Sharia do away with what we are seeing currently in the Islamic world and the inability of capitalism to solve world problems?
Sharia is not a kind of a standard text. Sharia simply means a way, a path. We have American Sharia when we accept certain things like this is the American way. This is the spirit of our Constitution. This is our Sharia. By simply applying the Arabic word to the concept, it doesn't make that any more or any less extremist. In many Muslim societies, the civil codes and the civil laws are based on constitutions as much as on ethics that would be based on their religious edicts. Just like we have Judeo-Christian concepts here in the West, or we have manifest destiny here in the West, a lot of these have a religion as its underpinning, and that's fine because the society in general is so. And so in the Muslim societies, these things do happen. But for a lot of people, when they throw the word Sharia, it things like, first, it has to be a kind of a inflexible, rigid code of conduct of centuries back, and that it is nothing but religion itself. It's far from that. It's simply it's a way of life where a society conducts its affairs. And in these,
is there a common way, or is it different countries have different ways?
No, different countries have to have different ways, because that, in fact, is the order of the Quran. Is that if God willed it, it would have been one law for all humanity. But the Quran says that you have been created into tribes and factions and groups, so that you conduct your ways individually in your own ways, but you have to strive in being better than others in doing that. So there is Sharia is a way of life in Pakistan, it's in Saudi Arabia, it could be in Egypt, it could be in Tunisia, everywhere. So Sharia is not, they are in a way trying to create it or to make it as the new boogeyman, as jihad had become. And jihad simply means struggle. And when Americans were rebelling against the British, that was their jihad. We did not want to accept injustice, taxation without representation, to encapsulate it in that one phrase. So people don't accept injustice. And when you struggle against it, that's jihad. And the same thing right now. If you use a way of life that is based on custom, traditions, as well as religion, but not exclusively religion, that is your Sharia, that's your way. You know it better than I do. That the word in Arabic means the path, the way, the confluence of thought and ideas that go in a certain direction.
Perfect. Let's shift gears and talk about Libya. Because I want to know your take on what do you think about what's happening. Are we facing a complete regime change? Where are we going with Libya? And this is a clip, number 6 for Brittany back there. And it's Libya's could be facing a complete regime change. We'll watch it, and when we come back, we'll talk more. It's a pleasure having you, Dr. Stanizai.
Thank you.
John Lyne's been monitoring developments from Cairo in Egypt, and he joins us on the line now. Morning, John. Very difficult to get a clear picture of what's going on in Libya, but one big question now is, where is Colonel Gaddafi?
Yeah, my instinct is he probably still is in Libya. There was a rumour swept the country last night that he had fled. Crowds came out on the streets to celebrate. They thought it was all over. But Saif al-Islam Gaddafi then appeared on television, insisted his father would stay, was still in Libya, and indeed I think it's very unlikely that the son would still be around if his father had fled, because he would surely know that his life would be in severe danger, as I think it already is. And also people have said to me, in any case, there probably aren't any countries that would accept Colonel Gaddafi. Even Saudi Arabia, which took President Ben Ali of Tunisia, they've had a falling out with Colonel Gaddafi. So I think he probably is there, and Libyans fear, of course, he's going to carry out his threat to battle it out until the last man and the last bullet.
Yeah, because there have been sort of growing suggestions from people watching from abroad that time is running out for him. What's that based on?
Oh, I think it's looking increasingly clear that it's only a matter of time and a matter of how bloody and violent the end is. He's lost control of almost the entire eastern part of the country. Now for the first time we've got widespread demonstrations in Tripoli. Indeed, at times last night it seems like he'd lost control even of the capital. The security forces had melted away. Army units have been defecting, foreign diplomats have been defecting, tribal leaders have been defecting. It really is coming down to the bunker now. It could be a very nasty few days.
And if he was to go, who could replace him?
Well, there's no half measures, I think, in Libya. It's not like here in Egypt where a lot of the same people are still in power. I think in Libya it really will be regime change, because Colonel Gaddafi is the regime, and the regime, I think as we're coming to realise if we didn't, is absolutely detested. So I think it will be a complete regime change, and yes, there could be some degree of chaos, but all the opposition are determined to make it as orderly as possible, and they say the areas they have under their control in eastern Libya are now peaceful. So I think but it is of course going to be uncharted territory.
Very difficult to get a handle on what's actually going on. We're looking at some mobile phone pictures of some unrest which someone's managed to get out, because they have been cracking down on internet connections and phone lines. So how are we finding out what's going on inside Libya?
Well, it has been possible. I've been able to speak to quite a few people on the phone. A lot of exiles have also got a good network of contacts, so I speak to them. They've even established some satellite connections in Benghazi, the second city. They've even set up a pirate TV and radio station, so they really, they're kind of, they'd call it liberated territory there. So there is quite a lot of information coming out. Yeah, the internet is difficult, and of course state TV is utterly disconnected now from any idea of reality of what is going on there. But we are getting a picture. It's not necessarily right up to the minute, but we are seeing a clear trend of this regime collapsing slowly or actually quite quickly.
We'll come back to international politics. We are live and online at Dominguez Hills, DHTV, and we are discussing current event. And we just saw a clip on Libya, regime change in Libya. With me in studio, Dr. Zaman Stanizai. Dr. Stanizai, what's your reaction about the video? The first question I'd like to ask you, where is Gaddafi?
Well, I'm not interested in individuals. I am interested more in...
You are not interested in finding where he is?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
The point is that he might symbolize a particular type of a boogeyman that the media wants to portray him, and he might deservedly be so. That's not the question. The problem, I think, with the Libya is that I think the revolutions that started, the way it's termed, the Arab Spring,
in Tunisia.
In most of the region, North Africa and Southeast Asia, caught everyone by surprise. Whereas for most of us, that as, let's say, audience of a TV screen, we looked at it with surprise, and maybe we had to react to it in certain ways, but there were people in governments that had to react to it in a way that they had to take actions.
Okay.
And as far as the East-West concern, or the Muslim-non-Muslim relationship, I mean the Muslim East in the Middle East and the Christian West, in the context of that relation, there were serious problems, because for one, the Western intelligence could not predict it, like they have failed us to predict the major events in the turn of almost every decade in the last 40 years. And the second thing was what to do about it. So the first approach in the case of Tunisia and Egypt was an accommodation. Let's see, it was declared that there should be peaceful transition, that there shouldn't be violence, and we wanted to operate that in that way. But what happened was that the people didn't trust this position, this attitude from the West, nor did they trust their leaders in Egypt and Tunisia, and the governments were overthrown. Now, what happened was that I think the fear in the West was that if this, I don't mean to say it in a derogatory, but if prairie fire, if it keeps going east to the Persian Gulf, the oil-rich countries, where we have more interest, then it will be difficult to control it there. So in my opinion, Libya was a good, fair distance, far from that area of danger. So plans were probably made to see if it could be controlled here, far away from, say, the danger zone. But there's also the background in terms of why this happened. Gaddafi used to be the most favorite dictator, Arab dictator of the Europeans, at least for the last several years, that he was pitching his tent in Paris and in Rome, and was received with the unparalleled welcome by Berlusconi and Sarkozy and all that. And Italy and Libya became, Italy became Libya's major trade partner because the Libyans invested tons of money. And Libya also signed a $6.5 billion worth of a contract with France, I think in 2007, which included the sale of nuclear plants, as well as the Rafale fighters and all that. And so
that's 2007. That's after the Libyans had
after they had admitted that taken responsibility for the Lockerbie, and after they paid $2.7 billion to the victims, and after, even in the United States, his PR firms tried to polish his image, and he happened to become the author of an op-ed in the New York Times, and so all these efforts were made, like, forget the Gaddafi that we had portrayed as the bad guy. Gaddafi is a wonderful person. And so all this was going on until one thing happened, which was the defection of an ex-chief intelligence officer from Libya who defected to France. And the French kept him, protected him. And his suggestion to the French was that, look, we have to overthrow Gaddafi, and we can start a rebellion against him in Benghazi. And the French supported this, and the Libyans, or Gaddafi personally, I'm sure, felt very offended that while they were having this cordial relationship and trade and all this, why would France do such a thing? So Libya canceled the $6.5 billion contract with France. And of course, France was itching for revenge. What they did instead was that they were looking for every opportunity. They had several military maneuvers with the British, and they moved the Charles de Gaulle carrier to the Mediterranean along with the USS, I forgot the name of the Enterprise, I think. And so all these things were planned in advance, that the French had to do something about Gaddafi. Now, they were just so lucky that the Arab Spring came at the right time, and that their pre-planning was made look like, oh, it was just a reaction towards current events, and we are trying to protect civilian lives. But the truth is that that wasn't the thing, that they had planned this whole thing in advance. And that is the reason why, if you look, the first attack was done by France. They initiated the attack, the bombing, and their maneuvers with the U.S. naval forces and all that. And also the organization of this whole plan was done in Paris. So France was at the forefront of it, and the media is, I think, asleep at the wheel. They are not even questioning, like, why is France so eager to attack Libya?
Well, some would say that Libya, because it's the opposite of what you just said, because the opposite in the sense that they felt that the French did not have enough business deals with the Libyans. Perhaps your last conclusion can be drawn in that context. And they want to impose, be in control of the region. Remember, France has always seen Northern Africa, not including Libya, as part of its sort of zone of influence.
Of course. Yeah.
So the argument, perhaps this could be in that historical context of being the colonizer
the facts speak louder here. The $6.5 billion contract, that is a major one. And it was that contract that Sarkozy, in spite of all his anti-Islamic attitude that he has in his own country towards Muslim, he allows Gaddafi to come and pitch his tent in the Elysee Palace. Well, and so the accommodations to this dictator that they did at the time, and the attitude they have towards him now, this 180-degree turn had to have had a more fundamental cause.
I agree with you, but that accommodation really can be explained by historical context. For example, Mubarak was treated the same way. Gaddafi's visit to Italy, even to the United States, he brought his own tent. So Gaddafi is known for that kind of behavior, but also Gaddafi, when he shows up to a place, he brings a lot of business. I mean, his trip to one of the African countries was 18 planes with all whatever fancy cars, all that stuff, and then the tent. So that doesn't work. But here is the question for you, and I think that is relevant also to look at, is what does the West want out of Libya? Does the West want a two-state solution? Because really the indication is there that we are going to live in a protracted conflict. Or does it want actually regime change, get rid of Gaddafi and establish united Libya? Or else, what exactly the West wants?
Well, in my opinion, the West wants to stop the Arab Spring in its tracks. And it can be done once you turn a legitimate revolution into a civil war, and a bloody civil war.
Has it worked so far?
Well, it seems like then people would look at the alternative. Because when they thought, like in Tunisia, you do a protest for...
It was an easy revolution.
For 2-3 weeks, and all of a sudden you change the government. If it's this easy, without much bloodshed, that's a wonderful thing. Why not do it?
And
so what we did in Libya is that, contrary to our attitude towards the peaceful transfer of power in the other countries in Libya, we immediately said, President Obama said Gaddafi must go. The United Nations came up with a resolution that introduced Gaddafi for persecution to the International Criminal Court, and Sarkozy and the other European leaders say the same thing. So once he was, his back was to the wall, he had no choice, because we told, in a way, in an indirect way, we forced Gaddafi through provocation to fight. And when he had to fight for his life, the eccentric person that he is, of course he had to. What else would you expect? But if we had, said to him, or like the peaceful gesture we are giving out to the Yemeni president, is that, oh yeah, we can have a negotiated transfer. None of these were offered to Libya, because we, in a way, wanted to make it bloody. Now, the end result, in my opinion, would be that no matter what happens, the West wins. If Gaddafi wins, he will once again, we go through this total change of attitude too. And if the group over in Benghazi wins, they will not win on their own right except through a Western assistance. And if that happens, they will be beholden to the West.
Yeah.
Of course.
So you could,
Now, if it happens to become a two states, and in this case both states would be belligerent towards each other, and the weapons that they will need will of course come from the West, which is good again for our business. If they become independent countries, they will become smaller and more vulnerable to foreign pressure, which in this case will be Western pressure. So no matter what happens, the West cannot lose now in Libya. And this could also say, if Gaddafi wins, it becomes a good model for other dictators in the region to treat their citizens, not that they are holding back, but that will give them a green light even more so. So this happens in a time when the echo of Obama's voice is still in the streets of Cairo, and he was siding with the dictator rather with the people.
Yeah.
And so in Libya it will be the same thing. We could allow this, the more we allow it to linger, the prolongation of this war would take the wind out of the sail of the Arab Spring.
Okay. Let's go back to the questions because I want to get to them before we end this class. Corina, thank you so much, Corina, for your contribution to the class. Corina writes, to what extent should international lawmakers take religion and culture into consideration before making laws? What do you think?
Well, I think it's inevitable. Every society has a culture.
This is about international law, yeah.
Yeah, but culture is inclusive.
Okay.
And religion is part of that.
Okay.
When we are talking about Protestant ethics, we are talking about John Locke, we are talking about the American model is not a secular model. That's what's often misunderstood.
You mean American model is a religious model?
No. Well, let me put it this way. The European model is a secular model because it was the Europeans who rebelled against religious theocracy.
Okay. Yeah.
And what they established was, by virtue of the events, that it had to be then, in a way, anti-religious, or at least non-religious. So that was secularism. The people who ran away from those problems in Europe, where did they go? They came to America.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Americans were very religious then, and they are now. That's why comparing, like, church attendance as a criteria, the United States is close to 90%, whereas Europeans are close to 5%. So Europeans are secular, Americans are not. The American system calls for an accommodation, which is the separation of church and state. This very statement indicates that religion is then part of it, part of the culture, but they have to operate separately. I mean, we could point to the faith-based initiatives and all that, or a lot of other values that we get from the various forms of religion that is practiced in America, that we are not necessarily
Take us back to international law. Because
so then the international law, that the laws that we have, it's the laws of individual nations that in a way influence international law. So international law cannot totally ignore religious values, religious morals. Now, they don't have to become theocracy, they don't have to advocate theocracy, but you cannot exclude religion from it, or religious values. And again, when it comes to ethics and morality, and I do not mean that ethics and moralities are the sole domain of religion or religious people. They could fall outside of that too, but nonetheless they could not be ignored, and the animosity between the two is a very, very European thing.
Well, if you tell me ethics and religions are not to be ignored, then one could make the argument that the foreign policy of the United States, in this case of Libya, is driven by ethics and morals. And their argument is that they prevented a major disaster.
They claim it so.
Yeah.
If they were fighting for American ideals rather than corporate interests, I would have agreed. But it's the corporate interest that trumps American ideals. And if this is, when you look at the way, take the United States, for instance, in its dealing, one other faction of the connection of the Libyan thing is that the United States give a green light to the Saudis to invade Bahrain in exchange for their vote through the Arab League to allow a new no-fly zone in Libya. In other words, this had to be the unholiest of alliances. where two parties get together and says, okay, you invade your neighbor and I'm going to invade this guy over here.
I'm with you. And
so there's no moral ground for that.
I'm with you. I have no problem with that, and I could buy that argument. I need to see some evidence. It's fine.
The evidence is in Asia Times.
Okay.
Pepe Escobar is the author.
No problem, but I also have some facts. Okay. Today, the Libyan Prime Minister, former Interior Minister Yunus, complained that, look, the NATO is not doing its job. We give them target to hit, they don't hit. It was the Arab League, whatever you want to say it, and with the blessing of the Benghazi group, to get the foreign presence into Libya. They're the one who complained that there is a humanitarian crisis. This is not, in other words, even if you tell me that it's corporate, I buy it, and I'm not against it. I see where you're coming from, but I'm not against, meaning that I'm not against the argument that this is driven by. But I also see the other side, that the Libyans are asking for this. So what do we make of it?
Well, I'm very familiar with that. It was the Afghan government who asked the Soviet Union to invade their country, to save them from the encroachment of Western capitalists.
But do you think, Dr. Stanizai, that the comparison is relevant here?
The comparison is relevant in a way that in the colonial period, they probably didn't have the sophistication, or there was not enough pressure of the public opinion. But nowadays it is. So the governments, when they take their action, they want to make it sound politically so correct. That, just take the French example, for instance, that we know why France attacked Libya, but they had to say, oh, it's to save civilian lives. Or the Americans, and it's the same Americans, or the French for that matter, but in case of Americans in particular, that the reason the Muslim world would be looking at this with very profound skepticism is that when it comes to the civilians in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen and Bahrain and all those places, there's a 180-degree difference in the way we treat. So if it is really for citizens, why would we would be bombing civilians through air drone attacks and all that in Afghanistan, and then we bomb them today, tomorrow we go and we apologize. We bomb the day after, and then 2 days later we apologize. These apologies have become so repetitious that it shows clearly that there's just absolutely no sincerity. It's total indifference towards human value and civilian life. That is civilian life. In 2010, the casualty of civilians was close to 2,000. I don't think that the number of civilians in Libya has reached that. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't. But the point is that the claim is a politically correct statement to accommodate and sell it to the public here in the West. Over there, they don't buy it. Just imagine that on the Mediterranean shore, there are some poor Libyans. One day they are running east, and one day they are running west. Just like the Morocco and Morocco, the two winds in North Africa, that 6 months they will blow from one direction to the other, and 6 months later they switch direction. That is exactly what's happening to the people. I said it earlier, prolongation. Okay, when we prolong it and make it more of a conflict, it creates a lot of disincentive for others to rise against the dictators.
Maybe that's a good segue. Romana has a question for you, Dr. Stanizai. Is there any truth to the allegation that all Islamic governments are run de facto by the West, who own their oil reserves?
Well, number one, there are no Islamic governments.
Maybe she meant government of Muslim
The governments of Muslim majority states.
Can you explain the difference?
Well, Islamic governments were a kind of the early pluralistic system, at least in the Medina model, was one where when the Muslims took over, they created a system where there was religious pluralism. Jews had to follow their religion within the system, Christians, Muslims, etc., etc. So it was secular as well as and religious and non-religious pluralism. That was Islamic. Now, because those words were used 1400 years ago, a lot of people, a lot of these modern-day dictators find it very convenient to call themselves first presidents, and they are not presidents. Most of them are not. And they call themselves, their governments or countries, Islamic government. There's nothing Islamic about most of these. The people are Muslim. But when you look at the behavior, what part of it makes Gaddafi, quote unquote, an Islamic president or a leader when he keeps killing his own people? I mean, we see it day and night, and the same thing goes in Yemen, in Bahrain, and so forth, and in Syria. First, there is no Islamic government. The second thing was, I think I forgot now the heart of the question.
The question was, is it true that all so-called Islamic governments are run by the West because to control their reserves, their oil reserves?
They would have to be, because if you look at the flip side of the coin, is that every legitimate revolution or movement for freedom has been brought down by the West. Whether it was the Iranian Revolution of 1952 with Mossadegh, it was brought down by CIA. And then we had 5 years later, a few years later, 1958 in Iraq, and elsewhere. So that's why the when people speak, we stand against this, because if the United States stays as a nation, there is no problem with having a democracy at home and abroad. But if we act in an imperial capacity, then there is a contradiction. Because if we are interested in their resources, a legitimate leader of Libya or Saudi Arabia or Bahrain would take the interests of their own people into consideration first, and those of the United States second. And we don't want that. So in order for us for those leaders to consider Western interest, to give it a priority first, then they have to ignore their own people. And so they automatically become dictators.
Dr. Stanizai, we have to stop here. And I'm sure we'll see you again in the future. But we come to the end of this class. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you every week on this station. And I hope you learned a great deal for those who are taking the class, and for those who are watching. I hope we were balanced in our views. We gave you what you were looking for. And until next time, those of you who are studying, keep studying, and those who are watching, keep watching us. And good luck.